All right, guys, so this is a huge story here that I wanted to share with you, and it sort of validates something that I've been thinking quite a bit lately. So let me point out up front, Nate Silver actually made this point the other day, and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, this is what we were all thinking anyway, and now he's like catching up after the fact. He is now accusing most of the major polling outlets of doing what's called herding. Namely, just sort of rig the deck and say, it's 50-50, and they're doing it so that at the end of the day, they don't look ridiculous if they end up, missing with their predictions. If they're polling as Kamala winning and Trump wins, they're going to feel stupid. So they're just go, oh, yeah, it's 50-50. That's why we saw, I believe it was 4 major pollsters come out the other week and say 49-49, it's perfectly tied. That's very sketchy, right? So now, outside of those major polling outlets, you have the right-wing hack outlets, which were the most correct in like 2016, but then in 2022, they were the most incorrect, right? So you got to take them for what they're worth. They are super biased. But there are like a handful of pollsters who are still doing real polling. And we showed you one on the show the other day. It was Kamala Harris +4 in an Ipsos poll. An Ipsos poll that was pretty predictive in 2012 when Barack Obama won. It said he was up 3 and he ended up winning by 4. Okay, so in other words, even Nate Silver's like, hey, they're kind of hurting, so I don't know how much these polls are worth anymore, right? Well, on top of that point, which, it's tied, everything's tied, everything's within the margin of error. Here is CNN finally admitting something that we've kind of been screaming from the rooftops for a while now about polling misses and about, in this election, what's a possibility which very few people are actually talking about. We've had the conversation about, look, Trump was underestimated in 2016 in the polls. Trump was underestimated in 2020 in the polls. But is it possible that Kamala Harris this time is actually underestimated, that her support is underestimated? Watch this.
That's all we hear about. Donald Trump's going to outperform his polls. So I went back and checked out whether or not a party outran the polls 3 presidential election cycles in a row in the key battleground states. It's never happened. It's never happened. 0 times since 1972. So if the polls are going to underestimate Donald Trump once again, that would be historically unprecedented. Now, maybe you want to make the argument that Donald Trump himself is historically unprecedented, but what normally happens is the pollsters catch on, hey, we're underestimating, we're not taking into account some part of the electorate. They make adjustments, and I think that helps to explain why we have never seen that the same party has been underestimated 3 times in a row in presidential elections, at least over the last 52 years.
And Harry, you're seeing other evidence here that a polling miss, as we'll call it, wouldn't necessarily even benefit Trump as much this time.
Yeah. So, if we went back to 2020, right, all the polls, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan, those 3 key Great Lake battleground states, they favored Trump by a wide margin. But there was this group of pollsters that actually had Trump out ahead. And indeed, Donald Trump's best polls in 2020 were 8 points better than the poll averages in those states. So there was this idea, this universe, hey, maybe the averages are really underestimating Donald Trump. This time around, the question that I had was, are there still these polls that may indicate that the averages are really underestimating Donald Trump? This time around, there's really not the evidence for it. The best polls for Trump actually only have him running about 3 points ahead of the polling average in the key Great Lake battleground states versus the 8 last time around.
So in other words, what he's saying is that these conservative Republican pollsters, last time they had polls that had him like 8 points better than the average in certain states, right? This time, those pollsters only have him 3 points better than the average in certain states. Okay, here we go. He's not done.
This group of pollsters that said, hey, wait a minute, the polling average may be underestimating Donald Trump. This time around, John, they simply put, do not exist. And one little last thing, I'll note that those polls that really underestimated Donald Trump were still too good for Donald Trump, the polls that indicated that the polling average was underestimating Donald Trump. So I wouldn't be surprised if even this is indicating, hey, wait a minute, these polls that suggest that Trump will do better than the average are actually too good for Trump.
Interesting way to look at it. And of course, we talked about 2016, 2020. We have had a big election since then.
That's exactly right. So, if the idea is that maybe the pollsters have, in fact, been making adjustments, you might have seen it in 2022. And what do we see in 2022 in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin? Well, it turns out that the average poll in those states actually underestimated Democrats by 4 points. It underestimated Democrats by 4 points. And I want to apply that to the electoral map, because if it turns out that the polls underestimate Donald Trump, or underestimated the Democrats, like they did in 2022, what happens? Well, Kamala Harris wins a sweep because she wins all these Great Lake battleground states. She wins down in the Southeast, and she wins down in the Southwest, and she gets the 319 electoral votes. The bottom line is this, dear audience and Mr. Berman. I think a lot of folks are sort of counting in that Donald Trump will, in fact, be underestimated by the polls. But when I'm looking at the evidence, I think you got to hold on a second. Maybe that'll happen. Maybe it'll happen. But I think that there are folks who are underestimating the idea that maybe Kamala Harris will be underestimated by the polls at least a week out.
A public service announcement from our senior data reporter, Harry N. Thank you.
Thank you.
Much.
Everybody overlooks 2022. Everybody overlooks it. It was a midterm election. It was a giant election. And the Democrats overperformed. Another point that they didn't bring up is in special elections, since the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Democrats are massively overperforming the polls. So everybody's got this thing in their mind of 2016 and 2020, where Trump himself overperformed, right? And it's fair to think about that and consider that. But in every election since then, the Republicans, and specifically the Trump-like Republicans, have underperformed massively. Guys, think about it. Blake Masters, draxed. Carrie Lake, draxed. Doug Mastriano, draxed. So many of them. Now Mark Robinson, draxed. Herschel Walker lost. Dr. Oz lost. All the hand-picked Trump people who were most Trumpy. Lost. Right? In fact, if anything, the generic Republicans tend to do better, like Kemp in Georgia. Right? So people are memory holing not only 2022, but the reason for what happened in 2022. Namely, Roe v. Wade was overturned by a Republican Supreme Court where 3 justices were handpicked by Donald Trump. And also, guys, here's an interesting point. I bet this hadn't really occurred to a lot of you. This is the first election with Trump on the ballot since January 6th. It is. And since the 91 criminal charges, and since he became a convicted felon because of that case in the state of New York. Like, bro, are we all looking at this the wrong way? Because if the pollsters are hurting, which even now Nate Silver is saying it looks like they're hurting, and the ones that aren't have Kamala like +4, right? What are we really looking at here? Is it really 2016 or is it like 2012, Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, right? So look, we'll see. But there is plenty of evidence to indicate that if anything, it might be Kamala's support that's underestimated. And, we've seen a lot of data points, and I brought them to you on this show that indicate that's kind of already happening, right? It's kind of already happening in some of the early vote numbers that we've seen, in some of the late polling that's come out. It's nice to me that they're finally starting to entertain this idea, because the default perspective you hear everywhere, Trump's people are like super convinced he's going to win. I think a lot of that is because of their propaganda, and they're planning on trying to steal the election. But the Trump people are super convinced. But you even hear people who are not Trump people say, well, yeah, he was underestimated in 2016 and 2020. So, but that's denying everything that's happened since then. So I don't know. My best guess is either the polls are like exactly right, and it's like a razor thin election, or Kamala's underestimated. That's my best guess now. But most importantly, I'm going to keep my eye out for what Michael Moore says. Because Michael Moore, he got pretty much every election right from 2016 and on. And remember, a lot of those picks were, people were like mocking him for it, and then he was right. So I think he has Kamala winning, but I'll go take a look. But got my eye on what he says, because he's been one of the best predictors. Also, Edinger Mentum has been great at predicting. We'll see what happens, but it's very likely that Kamala is not only underestimated, but maybe significantly underestimated. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.